The disappearance of the Portlock loggers. Portlock, Alaska, sits on the southern edge of the Kenai Peninsula, and though officially abandoned since the 1950s, stories of its strange history still drift into nearby villages. Locals refer to it simply as the place where the woods watch you. The last officially recorded tragedy tied to Portlock occurred in the summer of 1999, when a team of contract loggers out of Anchorage secured a short-term permit to harvest old-growth spruce in the hills just above the crumbling cannery ruins. The group consisted of 6 men and 1 woman, most in their late 20s to 40s, all experienced in remote work. For the first week, things went smoothly. They used refurbished cabins near the shoreline as a base camp and ferried logs by barge every 3 days. Satellite phone check-ins with the contracting office confirmed steady progress. But on the 9th day, the calls stopped. At first, their absence was attributed to technical issues. Storm interference was common along the peninsula. By the 12th day, a helicopter was dispatched. What rescuers found was unsettling. The camp appeared deserted, though meals were half prepared in the cabins, canned stew still warm in pots, instant coffee halfway dissolved in mugs. Chainsaws and protective gear were lined up along the cabin walls as if waiting for their owners. A deck of playing cards sat mid-game on one table, with someone's cigarettes still burning down to the filter. Yet not a single logger was present. Investigators began a systematic grid search of the surrounding forest. Only 2 pieces of evidence surfaced: a steel logging helmet bent nearly in half as if compressed by immense force, and a set of boot prints leading away from camp that simply stopped at the tree line. An even stranger detail emerged from one of the cabins. Carved into the wood near the bunk beds were dozens of deep, frantic scratches. Not words, not symbols, just gouges, as though someone had been dragging sharpened tools or even claws against the walls in a blind frenzy. Local villagers who were questioned by Alaska state troopers offered little comfort. Elders repeated stories of their Nantinak, a half-man, half-creature said to roam the mountains around Portlock. Others refused to speak at all, warning the search teams that the land itself rejects outsiders. After 2 weeks, the search was officially suspended. The 7 loggers remain missing to this day, their case filed under unresolved wilderness disappearance. The contracting company went bankrupt shortly afterward, and Portlock remains deserted. But perhaps the most chilling testimony came from one of the helicopter crew, who later admitted, off the record, that during their sweeps, they repeatedly picked up heat signatures moving just inside the forest perimeter. Large, upright shapes that seemed to vanish whenever approached. Even now, more than 2 decades later, hunters and fishermen refuse to camp overnight near Portlock. They say the silence there is wrong, too absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of trees cracking deep in the hills, as if something heavy and unseen moves just beyond sight. Story 2. The Shagaluk Ferry Incident. In June of 1987, a small river ferry operating along the Innaker River near the Athabascan village of Shagaluk carried 8 passengers, a mix of locals and 3 tourists from Oregon traveling north to fish. The ferry operator, George Miller, was well known and trusted, with over 20 years on the water. According to official logs, the ferry left Shagaluk at 3:12 p.m. on a clear afternoon. It was scheduled to reach a nearby dock just 40 minutes upstream. It never arrived. When a search boat was dispatched, investigators expected to find a breakdown or capsizing. Instead, they located the ferry drifting slowly in a side channel. Its engine was idling. The boat itself showed no signs of damage, no flooding, and no signs of collision. But the passengers were gone. Every personal belonging, from fishing rods to purses and even a 6-pack of unopened beer, remained neatly arranged. Life jackets were stacked in their storage bins. A half-eaten sandwich sat on a bench, as if dropped mid-bite. Most disturbing, Miller's logbook. His last entry, Written in shaky handwriting, read, "River is wrong. It's pulling backwards. Do you hear them singing?" For weeks, state troopers combed the riverbanks and nearby woods. They found no tracks, no signs of struggle, and no bodies. The only clue came from a trapper who claimed he'd heard a singing voices on the water the night after the disappearance. He described it as like a church choir under the river. To this day, locals refuse to take ferries at dusk on that stretch of river. Old Athabascan stories speak of the underwater people, a spirit said to pull travelers beneath the current. The Shagaluk Ferry incident remains one of Alaska's eeriest mass vanishings, filed quietly in the archives as the unresolved, suspected drowning, although no evidence has ever supported that explanation. Story 3. The Kavalinor Night Whispers. Kavalinor, a small Inupiat village perched on a narrow barrier island, has battled harsh storms and rising seas for decades. But in the winter of 2003, residents faced something far stranger. It began with children. Several reported hearing voices outside their homes after dark. The voices were described as familiar: siblings, cousins, or even parents, calling them by name, begging them to come outside. But when adults checked, no one was there. Within weeks, nearly every family in the village had a story. Some claimed to hear entire conversations outside their windows, mimicking the voices of relatives who were asleep inside. Dogs began acting strange, refusing to leave their kennels at night, barking and whining at empty stretches of tundra. The elders warned that the community was experiencing visits from the Kalupaliat, beings from traditional stories who lure the unwary into the icy sea. Parents were told to keep children indoors after sundown. Then came the case of Jacob Orne, a 17-year-old boy. In February, he told friends that he'd heard his late grandmother calling his name from the frozen lagoon. They laughed it off, but that night he vanished from his family's home. His footprints led directly across the ice and ended halfway to the water. No body was ever recovered. Following Jacob's disappearance, nightly ill whispers intensified. Several adults admitted hearing their own names spoken in voices that belonged to long-dead relatives. Some described the voices coming not from outside, but from directly beneath the floorboards. By spring, when the sea ice began breaking apart, the phenomenon ceased as abruptly as it began. But Jacob was never found. To this day, Kavalinor residents tell children not to answer when they hear their name after dark, because on that island, not every voice belongs to the living. Story 4. The Norvik Hunters' Circle. In the fall of 1995, two cousins from Norvik, both experienced subsistence hunters, set out into the tundra to track caribou. They carried rifles, snow machines, and a radio tuned to local frequency. At 11:42 a.m., the older cousin radioed home, saying they'd spotted a small herd near a ridge. His tone was casual, routine. That was the last time anyone heard from them. When the men failed to return, a volunteer search team followed their snow machine tracks out onto the tundra. The tracks led straight to a clearing on the ridge, and stopped. Both snow machines sat idling side by side. Rifles leaned neatly against the seats. A freshly dressed caribou carcass was half bundled in tarp nearby. But the men were gone. What unnerved searchers most was the pattern in the snow around the machines. Dozens of small circular tracks, not human, not animal, ringed the site. Each was perfectly round, about the size of a coffee cup, pressed deep into the snow in a spiral formation. The circles formed a pattern like a coiled snake, tightening toward the center where the machines Saturday. Despite aerial sweeps and dog teams, no trace of the hunters was ever found. Elders later told troopers that the land near Norvik holds places known as the Circles of Hunger, spots where people vanish after walking into strange ground markings. They warned never to hunt alone near those ridges. To this day, locals avoid that stretch of tundra. When asked why, they simply say, the ground remembers." Story 5. The Phantom Teacher of Tanana. Tanana is a small Yukon River town, isolated and tight-knit. In the winter of 1974, children at the village school began insisting they had a new substitute teacher, a woman none of the staff recognized. The students described her vividly: tall, pale, with long black braids and an old-fashioned dress. She taught history lessons not in textbooks, but through stories of ancient battles and vanished settlements. Some children even claimed she spoke in a dialect none of them had heard before, yet somehow understood. Teachers dismissed it as childhood imagination, until students began turning in assignments written in handwriting that wasn't their own, signed with the name a Miss Nyland. Weeks later, a janitor reported hearing children reciting multiplication tables long after school hours. When he opened the classroom door, the room was empty, but chalk moved across the blackboard, writing out problems as if guided by an invisible hand. One night, the principal stayed late. She claimed she saw a woman matching the student's description standing at the far end of the hallway. When approached, the figure walked into a classroom and vanished. Historical records later revealed that in 1921, a teacher named Eliza Nyland had been assigned to Tanana but disappeared on her way upriver. Her sled team was found, but she never arrived in town. The incidents stopped abruptly in March, leaving behind only the strange assignments, which the school kept locked in a file. Older Tanana residents still whisper that sometimes, on stormy nights, children in their sleep mumble lessons from a teacher who never truly made it to class. Story 6. The Whittier Tunnel Shadows. Whittier, Alaska, is unique. Nearly the entire town lives in one massive Cold War building, and the only road in or out is through a 2-mile tunnel that closes each night. In February 2011, during a late-night tunnel closure, a freight truck driver called authorities reporting figures on the tunnel wall. His exact words: "They're walking right inside the concrete." Security cameras captured something unsettling. For 7 minutes, the tunnel lights flickered. During that time, grainy footage showed elongated shadows moving against the walls, shapes walking parallel to the truck, though no people were physically present. When the tunnel reopened the next morning, inspectors found fresh handprints smeared in condensation along the inside walls, over 6 feet high, stretching for nearly half a mile. Local maintenance crews still refuse to drive the tunnel alone after dark. Some say if you turn off your headlights in the middle, you can hear footsteps pacing alongside your vehicle, always just out of sight. One longtime resident put it simply: "This town was never meant for the living. We just borrowed it." Story 7. The Kotzebue Lights. Kotzebue sits above the Arctic Circle, a place where endless winter nights stretch for months. In December 1982, multiple families began reporting strange lights over the tundra, not auroras, but white beams moving in rigid geometric patterns, scanning the ice like searchlights. Snowmobilers chasing caribou claimed to see the beams touch the ground, leaving behind blackened, perfectly round scorch marks. Dogs refused to cross these circles, barking furiously until pulled away. One night, 2 teenage brothers went missing after telling their parents they were going to follow the moving stars. Their snow machine was later found still running, headlights pointed at one of the scorched patches. No footprints led away. The lights continued for nearly 3 weeks, then vanished. To this day, villagers say if you walk too far from Kotzebue in the dead of winter, the horizon sometimes blinks, as if something out there is searching, waiting for someone curious enough to follow. Story 8. The Aleknagik Lake Murmurs. Aleknagik, a lakeside village in southwest Alaska, is known for its salmon runs. But in 1999, fishermen began whispering about something new, voices carrying across the water at night. The voices weren't faint or distorted. They were clear, conversational, as though dozens of people stood out on the lake having casual chats. The problem? The ice was too thin for anyone to stand on. Several men swore they recognized the voices of relatives who had drowned years earlier. One fisherman dropped a microphone through a hole in the ice to record the sounds. The tape reportedly captured faint laughter, followed by a long, guttural moan that made him destroy the cassette in fear. The most frightening event came in March, when a search was launched for a boy who vanished while checking his family's fishnets. His sled was discovered abandoned at the shoreline, the nets still frozen solid in the ice. But his boots were found sitting neatly side by side at the water's edge. Elders caution that the lake remembers names. When it calls yours, they say, you should never answer, or the water will claim you. Story 9. The Nome Ascent. Nome has long been tied to disappearances. But one case from 1977 stands out. Two gold prospectors claimed they were climbing a low ridge outside town when they noticed a staircase of stone leading upward into the tundra. Not a natural formation, literal stairs, rough-hewn but deliberate, vanishing into the mist above. They followed the steps for what felt like hours, though their watches ticked only minutes. The higher they went, the quieter the world became, until even the wind stopped. The younger prospector described feeling a presence above them, as something waiting at the top. Terrified, he convinced his partner to turn back. When they returned, they realized they had descended in silence. Their voices made no sound until they reached the bottom. A week later, the older prospector vanished while out on a solo trip. His partner swore he'd gone back to their staircase. Hikers still report finding short stretches of stone steps buried in moss and tundra near Nome, steps that lead nowhere until the fog rolls in. Story 10. The Togiak Mass Sleep. Togiak, a remote fishing village, experienced one of the strangest incidents in modern Alaskan history. In October 2014, nearly the entire town, over 200 residents, fell asleep at the exact same time. It began around 9:13 p.m, when people reported overwhelming exhaustion, dropping into sleep wherever they stood, dinner tables, living rooms, even in the middle of phone calls. For nearly 6 hours, the village lay silent. When residents awoke, they all described the same dream, walking across endless snow under a black sky with no stars, following a tall figure in white that left no footprints. The dream ended at the edge of a vast frozen lake, where the figure turned and opened its arms. Several villagers later claimed they'd seen their dead relatives standing on the far side of the lake, beckoning. Doctors flown in the next day blamed carbon monoxide or mass hysteria, but no evidence supported those theories. The sleep event he has never repeated. Even now, Togiak residents warn visitors, if you ever feel unusually tired there, resist it. Because whatever called to them that night might still be waiting on the other side of the dream.